Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. Poppie is spelled P-O-P-P-I-E. At my website, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour. It is the beginning of the first book in an adventure series, or you can read my serialized novel, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. You can also find One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet in audio format on this podcast feed as well as its own podcast feed. All you need to do is type in One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet in any podcast app and it should come right up. Jumping over to our word of the week. Our word of the week is protract, and that means lengthen in time. Pretty simple. So if you ever hear something is protracted, it just means to lengthen in time specifically. So that's what somebody means when they say it. I guess it's simpler to say protract, but at the same time, it's, I don't know, posh, something like that. You don't really need to use the word. The word doesn't, there's a lot of words that don't need to exist. This is one of them. We are going to be talking about your cultural heritage in this week's episode. So for our accidental essence, we're going to be talking about integrating your cultural heritage and the importance of integrating your cultural heritage. And I think that it's a very interesting discussion, and I think that it is something that I think that if you are a writer, it's not something people think about often. I think it's something people pass over, and I think the reason why people pass over on it is because, a lot of prepositions right there, because it is people are busy and people have a lot of stuff going on. And I think that for me, when I'm doing actual writing, I'm just doing actual writing. In the planning process, I do try to incorporate my cultural heritage, not necessarily, if you live in the United States, you're probably a mix of many different cultures, right? You have all this, people say, oh, I'm German. Up here in Wisconsin, there's a lot of Germans, so it's not strange to say, oh, if you're going to guess at somebody's cultural heritage or where their ancestors came from, saying Germany isn't a safe bet. Let's just say that. So I'm part German, but I'm also part English, but I might be part Scottish, Russian, etc. There's quite a few different things that I am, but I'm not really that anyways, because I don't come from those places and I don't have that culture that I'm embedded with. But there is a cultural heritage that I have. And so I'm not talking about diving into where your family's from. It could be the case that you're diving into where your family's from, and that's important to what you're doing. You could use this information to do that, but I'm actually talking about the larger culture, okay? For most of you listening, that would be the larger culture that I'll be talking about is the West, right? You can think of this. I think that the best way to define the West is all those countries that were once considered Christendom in the Middle Ages, okay? And some people might be thinking, oh, well, that aren't we excluding people if we're talking about that? But I think that even though there's a lot of countries within, it's not every single, I don't even know if you'd consider every single European country. I think that there would be some Asian countries that would be part of that as well. But I think that every single country that is either that is part of that block of countries or is an outgrowth of those block of countries or has adopted the values of that block of countries, because there are different chunks of the world there were certain ideas and there were certain religions that were powerful in those large chunks of the world, and it changed how people did things and it changed how people developed. Now, you might say that it changed them for the worse. I'm not going to argue that right now. You might say it changed them for the better. You might have the idea that the Enlightenment kind of was a turning from Christianity and different things like that. I'm not arguing that right now, and I'm not actually. What I'm talking about can take on all those ideas, and you can run with what I'm talking about today. And you can use what I'm talking about today to actually, I think, make your work, make what you're talking about, make your writing deeper, or make your ideas deeper in your writing. Okay? So if you do live in central China, if you're listening to this, hello, that's pretty cool. If you live in central China, you can still take this and you can use your culture you can use your culture and look at your culture, and you can understand it. You can make your writing better or make whatever you're working on better at the same time. If you're someone who hates your culture, you can still do the exact same with it. If you're someone who thinks that you live in a specific country, you live in a specific culture, your country's embedded within a specific culture, and you think my culture is horrible, I think it's the worst thing ever. I still think that, first of all, there's likely things within your culture that are good. I think you're probably being pretty harsh on it in a way that you should look at both sides, because every culture has many things that come out of it that are good and many things that come out of it that are bad at the same time. For example, I think that there's this idea, and I think it's originally a Greek idea, actually. There's this idea of decadence. I believe it went back to the Greeks because people were afraid that if you had a democracy, what would happen is the individual people that make up a democracy, that pure democracy, would keep on voting for bread, essentially. They'd be like, oh, give us what we want. Give us what we want. We're going to keep on voting to take money away from that person, give it to us, take food away from those people, give it to us. We just want all these things to happen. And eventually they would get to the point where they have so much stuff. And I believe I don't know what the word is exactly that it's derived from, but I believe that's where the idea of decadence came from. You have all this stuff and you are indulgent with all these things, and I think there is an issue if you want to approach it from that direction with decadence in our culture. I think that we could I think it's probably a good thing if we step back and we simplify. I think there's a lot of people my age, and I think there's a lot of people in our culture who would think that. At the same time, they might look at me and say, well, look at all the things you have. So I mean, there is some, you're trying to measure. You look at somebody else, you say, oh, you have too much stuff. But then if you really look at yourself, you're suddenly like, oh, you have a lot of stuff too, looking at yourself. But in that situation, maybe it's more of a mindset toward physical objects and wealth that we need to change, rather than the fact that we have a lot of stuff. And that probably would change what we have and how we use it as well. So within my culture, I think that's a bad thing. So even if you think there's something bad within your culture, I don't think this changes the fact that you can still look at that culture and understand it and gain an appreciation for it. And that appreciation will actually help you make better art. I think right now, for those of you who don't know, and even those who've been listening a really long time, this podcast is my thoughts on different ideas, and if I say something in the past and then I suddenly switch it, and I'm talking about something differently, or you think I'm contradicting myself, it may be the case that my ideas have changed, because this podcast I'm not static, right? People change, people develop, people have different ideas, so I am not static. My ideas are not static. I'm coming into contact with things, and what I do, and maybe you can do this as well if you see this as something good, is I have an idea, and I keep that idea in my mind. It's in the back of my mind. If I come into a situation that that idea is related to, I test the idea, where I keep on thinking about the idea and I keep on trying to figure out whether that idea is correct. It's kind of like science, but it isn't a scientific process, and I'm not going to say it is, because it's not systematized in the same way. I think that people do this, and I think it's a natural thing. But what I do is I'm aware of what I'm doing. So when I go into a situation, I'm saying, I think this about this situation, and then I keep on trying to assess whether what I think is true based on more information that comes, based on conversations I have with people, the issues they bring up about it. In some cases, I come up with an idea and immediately I'm like, but maybe that's not true, because that doesn't really fit, or it seems to be the case that it doesn't fit reality perfectly. So maybe I'm going toward the correct information, but maybe I'm around the area, but maybe I haven't landed on the bullseye yet. So with this is something that I think I would, if I were to make a judgment, I would say that if you understand your culture, if you approach your culture in a way that isn't trying to demonize and isn't trying to gild, I don't remember what the other, maybe it's lionize your culture, maybe that's the best word for it. If you're approaching it with the understanding of you're trying to get at the truth of what your culture is. You're trying to get at the truth of what your history is, because that is part of your culture. I don't think you can separate the history and the culture. I think you need to know both, actually, to do it better. But I think if you're approaching it realistically, I think if you're approaching it with an understanding that you're trying to get to truth, the truth of it, and you're trying to get what's good out of it and what's bad out of it. You're trying to gain an understanding of it, as much of an understanding of it as you can. I think that you are going to necessarily, it's going to be the case that you are going to create better art. You're going to create deeper, better art just because you did that. It might not be the best art in the world. I'm not saying you're going to create a classic in any sense. I'm not saying that, you're a painter and suddenly you really dive into what the art is, what the culture is or what your culture is, that when you come out, you're going to create a classic piece. But I think that the work you're going to do after you actually take an honest look at your culture, not to demonize, not to make it and say it's the best thing ever, but look at it with an honest, truthful eye. I think that you're going to come out of the other side with better art. You're going to have deeper art. You're going to look at art in a different way. You're going to look at how you create art in a different way because you're going to be taking in that information. But I'm probably getting ahead of myself with this information. So art is embedded within culture, right? Because the person who created that art is within that specific culture, a very specific culture. So art is embedded within a culture. Art has to be embedded within a culture. And some people, I think there's certain people who think that their art is outside of the culture they're in, but any type of art you're creating is within that culture. And it is, I think I've talked about this in the past. I'm not sure exactly, but when you create art, well, actually I have. If you look at, I think it was 3 episodes, I had 3 episodes on craft, and I talked about this idea that craft is like speaking a language, and if you don't know how to speak the language well, you're not going to be able to communicate well, and if you don't know your craft well, you're not going to be able to communicate through your art well. Within like the Western tradition, the Western cultural tradition, there's this idea of the great conversation, and this idea is that there's all these people coming in, and all these people are talking, and all these people are bringing up ideas, and they're not maybe communicating directly, but for example, you have somebody like Aristotle, and Aristotle writes something, and he does his best thinking, the best thinking that he can do. And somebody else, there's a German philosopher that I can't remember his name of. He comes up, it's not Nietzsche, it's somebody else. He comes up and he says, oh, this is what I think about Aristotle. And then he builds off of Aristotle, or he flips Aristotle on his head, or he completely disagrees with Aristotle and he says he's completely wrong. And they're not communicating directly. They're not in the same room talking. In some cases, these great thinkers are, but they are, there's a conversation of a type going on where somebody interacts with somebody else's information, or somebody says, yeah, you were right, or your ideas were right at the beginning, but you didn't get everything correctly because you didn't have all the information you needed, or you had this one idea that was bad. I believe that art is engaging in that process. I believe that any type of art anyone creates is actually part of that conversation. Okay, it's not speaking in words necessarily, but it is communicating, right? I believe that any art, whether it's a grade school kid, who's just making art and they're like, oh, I'm just creating something. They're embedded within that culture. They are responding to things within their culture, even if they don't know it. Now, maybe there's a point in the past where someone doesn't understand language well enough or something like that. Or maybe they're they don't understand language, or they haven't been in the culture long enough. Maybe you have to hit 10 years old before you actually start creating art that's engaging with the culture. But at the same time, after you've been in that culture and you've been, I think the word is enculturated. Once you've been enculturated, once you've become part of that culture, you've gotten past the point of just being a baby or a toddler or whatever, and you start to speak and you start to act a specific way, you like certain things. I think that you are part of that conversation, even if you are a child. I don't think that you're saying the best things or communicating something profound should we put you Should we say that what you're saying is as valuable as Aristotle? I don't think that's the case, but I think you are still part of that conversation. And any person who's creating art, I think, is part of that conversation. What I believe is that the best artists understand where they fit within that culture. Okay, I think that the people who have a good handle on their craft and they also understand their culture are going to be creating something with more value than the person who either doesn't have a good handle on their craft or doesn't understand their culture. So to sum it up with everything I'm saying is the best art exists in the conversation of its cultural heritage. Okay, the best art exists within the conversation of its cultural heritage. And, it might be more and more difficult. I think it does become more and more difficult as a culture grows, as it gets longer. As a culture exists longer in time, I think it becomes harder to understand that culture, to actually dig in, because what you have to read, what you have to experience through art or the different aspects of culture, I think that it takes longer to do that. It takes longer to understand all these different things. It becomes more complex as time goes on. So it might be the case that the best art comes later on in time if a person is capable. So if there's someone who is extremely capable in their craft, I would say that they would probably create better art if they actually understand their culture than the person who came before them, because they're building even off of what that person has created. Some people, I'm sure a lot of people would push against this, and I think it's a fair criticism because there's been phenomenal art in the past. I think it's harder to approach the culture once it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and once there's more time, because there's so much to engage in. So it's a bigger challenge to actually make something that has a bigger cultural impact. But if you do create something with that larger cultural impact that it's at the peak of its craft and it has that large cultural impact, I think that it's going to be taking on more of the culture. It's going to be taking on a more complex culture, and because of that, it's going to let me pause for a second. There's different if you look at psychological theories, there's one that everybody learns if they go through any Psych 101 class or they go through a human growth and development class, and it's Erik Erikson's theory, where you go through different stages in your life. And I think that Freud actually had this idea too. But Erik Erikson said that every stage you go through some type of crisis. You're going to end up on either one side of the fence or the other, and one side's negative and one side's positive. One of the ones I always remember is toward the end of a person's life, there's a stage, and the two sides of the fence you can end up on are generativity, or creating something, or you are going out into the world and you're adding to the world, or stagnation. Okay, and I think that with art, every era of art, every maybe generation has to deal with some sort of crisis, some sort of thing that they have to get through. I think that within our culture, I think one thing that millennials are dealing with is they've been disconnected from religion, right? They've been disconnected from what their parents had. Some people might argue that the boomers were disconnected from religion, but culturally, I don't think they were. I think they were very much connected to a religion, and I think they were very much connected to the benefits and the good and the bad that come with that. And I think that the millennials, maybe the Gen Xers, were the first to actually come fully into this. But I think especially millennials, we come into a world that is I wouldn't call it post-Christian, but it is post-organized religion, right? Within the Western world, I think that that's the case. So I think millennials, one of the crisis, or one of them that they're dealing with, is the fact that we have to figure out how to go forward, and we have to decide: are we going to go back and we're going to be more like our parents, or are we going to go forward without the religion of our parents or grandparents? Quick note on that. So I think a lot of baby boomers, because I think they were the ones to turn away from religion more. I think a lot of the baby boomers, they did they decided that religion wasn't as important, and maybe it's because we were wealthier. The West was wealthier in general, so they're like, why do we need religion? We can provide for ourselves. But they didn't feel the cultural effects of it because the culture was still maintained in that sense, in that way, by the greatest generation and the silent generation, right? And I think that culture was maintained up until the silent generation kind of passed on the mantle to the baby boomers. And I'm sure there's people who understand these sociological things a lot more than I do. But from what I'm seeing and from what I'm understanding is that the baby boomers, once they got into power and once they became in charge of the culture fully, it flipped over, and now you have what the baby boomers created, the younger people are dealing with. I don't think that what you deal with in your youth and in your middle age are things that you created. I think the generation before you are responsible for those things. I think that you should be very grateful for the good things that come out of that, and that you should learn from the bad things that come out of that. But I think that that's how it works, and we aren't living in a world that was created by us. We're living in a world that was created by our parents and our grandparents. So the crises that are being dealt with by the millennials, I think, come from the baby boomers. But I think every generation goes through crises, maybe one crisis or maybe multiple different crises at the same time. And I think that as you go through those crises, if you are aware of the culture, if you are aware of your history, you can look back and you can deal with the crises. You can deal with those in a way that is better than the people who came before you, because you have 20/20 hindsight and you can make better decisions, right? So I think that as you go through time, if you come across one that hasn't been dealt with before, you're suddenly like, oh, in some sense you do have to keep on repeating the ones that came before, right? Because you're young and everybody goes through the process of aging and getting older and learning. But at the same time, you aren't completely blind. And we're dealing with certain things like AI right now. We're dealing with certain things like there's a big loss of meaning in my generation. There's questions of the culture. How long will... So, I live in the United States. If you're not from the United States, how long will the United States last? It seems like it's very divided right now. At the same time, there's everybody, a lot of people think that other people are, I don't know if they think they're evil or they think that their ideology is evil and different things like that. And I think that there's people on the right, if we want to just split it up by politics, there's people on the right who think that the left has an ideology that's evil, and there's people on the left that think that people on the right have an ideology that's evil, etc. So there's a lot of different things going on. You could say if we have it seems to be the case that we're dealing with more of there's a cultural revolution, maybe not a revolution, but there's cultural shifts going on, but there's technological shifts going on. There's shifts in the job market and stuff like that as well. So we are dealing with that, and somebody who can take on that cultural heritage and create something in the present day that does address the world and does address huge issues with not just one generation, but multiple generations, I think is creating something better. So why do I think that these artists understand their culture? Or why do I think the best artists understand their culture? Well, first of all, artists do exist in some cultural milieu, right? That's another word I can never say exactly right, so forgive me if I didn't say it right. They exist in this cultural heritage, and they are affected by that cultural heritage. And their art is going to be affected by that cultural heritage, whether they like it or not, okay? That art is going to be... They can't help but that art is going to affect it whether they like it or not. Even if they're pushing against their cultural heritage, that art is affecting what they're doing. If they don't like their culture, it's affecting them. If they do like their culture, it's affecting them. And those who are well versed in their cultural heritage are going to be more likely or more able to address that cultural heritage. They're going to be able to direct their art in the best way possible, in a way that doesn't misunderstand the cultural heritage. In the past, I talked about this idea of don't strawman different characters. And the reason why I talked about this is if there's someone who disagrees with you, right? If you disagree with a certain ideology or you disagree with a certain type of person, right? You just don't like a certain type of person, and you want to write them into your book, if you write them into your book and you approach it the way you usually do, right? You're like, this person's an idiot. If you write them into your book as an idiot, you are strawmanning that character. You're creating a character who you have just created to make fun of or knock down. You're not getting the full depth of what that type of person is, or why they're like that, or why they choose to believe what they believe or do what they do. Okay. One example might be, I don't really understand obesity. I like really, really fat people. I just don't understand it. I do like eating a lot. I do get that, but I don't understand getting to the point where you are unbelievably fat, right? To the point where it's almost amazing how large a person is. I understand being chubby. I understand having a gut. I understand that thing. But if you're huge, and I don't understand that. I don't understand people who get to the point where they can't get off of their couch, and I especially don't understand the people who are enabling them, who are getting them food, making sure they're okay, and different things like that. I don't understand that mindset. So if I approached that type of person and I made them a fat slob and I made them unthinking and I made it so they were very unlikable and I made it so that they were stupid and all these different things, I think I wouldn't be giving that position its due, right? I think that there's more to the psychology of that person than giving them the worst attributes in the world. I've actually run into a handful of people who are very large and or they are large. I would hope never to get that big to the point where it slows down their movement. And they seem to be very nice people. I think there's more to what's going on in their head and in their lives than them just being fat, right? I still don't understand it completely, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to approach that character in a way that is just demonizing them because of that one characteristic, or demonizing them, demonizing somebody I disagree with. I want to make them fuller. And I think that we can do that with our culture as well. I think that we can do it from two sides. We can say that our culture is the best thing in the world, or we can say that our culture is horrible. I think that it's more, with people in the arts, I think it is more of I think it's more popular to say your culture is horrible. I think it's more popular, and I think it's probably more useful to the culture to do this, and I think this is why it happens. I think it's more popular to criticize your culture in the arts, and I think that those people need to actually dig into the culture and dig into the history and dig into what's come before them so they can actually understand it and approach it in a way that's intelligent, okay? A person would not step into a job as a biologist with having never studied biology, and you can't actually talk about biology if you don't know anything about it. It's kind of like boomers with memes. My parents are they baby boomers? Yeah, they're baby boomers, I believe. I think that yeah. It's kind of like boomers with memes who want to be trendy and they want to be like, oh, I'm going to use memes. Boomers don't get how memes work generally. There's a few that I've seen that are doing it well, but most of the time you run into the memes they make, or they run into there's a joke about it where it's like you have a little comic strip. I couldn't even remember it because I barely see them anymore. You have a comic strip and it has like a joke on it, and then it says, oh, boomer humor, and that's the same thing with memes. They just don't get how they work, and most of the time younger people. So if you're a boomer, don't make memes. Let's just say that, because if you don't understand it, don't use it, because you just it looks foolish. Okay. But if you're a younger person and you see a meme that's made by somebody older, or you see a meme that there's memes about boomer memes, which is really funny. If you see a meme that's made by somebody older, most of the time you're cringing. You're like, oh, that was really bad, and it wasn't done well, and it was bad humor, and it was probably misusing the meme, and it was misusing the meme in the worst way possible to make it as uncomfortable as possible. Not understanding your cultural heritage is like trying to go on the internet and use memes when you've never actually used them before. Okay, It's trying to make memes when you don't know anything about memes. You aren't in that culture, okay? So younger people are probably going to understand me. And if you are someone who's younger making art, get in touch with your cultural heritage. Get in touch with where you're from, how your family works. Get in touch with the broader cultural heritage as well, so you don't turn into a boomer making memes, all right? No offense to boomers, just don't make memes. You're not good at it. Younger people are generally not good at certain things as well. Like... they're not good at a lot of things. They're not good at... Younger people don't... really young people don't do as well with thinking just because they haven't had as much experience. They're not as wise, let's just say that. Younger people aren't as wise typically as older people, but they can be wise. So yeah, that's what it's like. And I think that if you think of it that way and you're suddenly like, oh, so if I approach my culture in a way where I know nothing about my culture, I'm going to look like an idiot. Exactly, right? Exactly. Now, you can be critical. You can be critical of your culture, and I don't think there's any issue with that. Like I said, I think that art plays an important function in the world, in the culture itself, of pointing at certain things that are bad or pointing at certain things that we need to change. But at the same time, if it might be the case that you're pointing at something that needs to be changed, and there's other people, like dozens of people, who've already approached that and done a better job of you with pointing at that thing, and the culture already knows it's an issue. Okay, so there might already be people. You're not the first person in the world. I'm not the first person in the world. You're not the first person in the world. Other people have had thoughts similar to yours. Other people have been young before. One of the biggest shames is a lot of people who were young, because everybody is young at some point. A lot of older people forget what it's like to be young, so they don't know how to approach younger people, but they were young and they dealt with things that you dealt with, and your experience during childhood and your teenage years and your early adult years and your midlife and different things like that. People have gone before you, and they've had similar experiences, and they've come to similar conclusions. They've had similar thoughts. They've had similar issues. They've had pains similar to yours. And I think that without looking back and looking at people who came before you, you're going to be like, I had this wonderful idea. This is what it's like. I had this wonderful idea. Everything seems to be pulled down toward the earth. Maybe there's a force, and we can call that force gravity. And that's what's pulling everything toward the earth. So there's this force that everything that has mass has this force, and it's drawing other things to it. Well, that's already been someone already came up with that idea a long time ago. And that's kind of what it's like when you approach your culture in a way where you don't understand your culture. Okay, you approach it in a way, and then you say something. You're like, oh, death comes to all of us, At the end of everything is death. Therefore, we should. Life sucks. Therefore, we shouldn't work. We shouldn't try anything. We should forget about life. We should just have pleasure. And you think that's a profound statement. You think it's something new. People have been saying that for a very long time. People have been approaching life, and they've been coming to that conclusion, or they've been rejecting that conclusion for a very long time. They know that people have said that it's not something new. And you can say something new without knowing what came before you, but you're going to know if it is something new if you know your culture. And you might be saying, well, how is that going to help me with my art? You can actually integrate your culture into art. You can actually integrate what came before you. It might be the case that you're approaching a question that's been asked 1,000 times, and people have answered it 1,000 times. If you know your culture, if you've studied your culture, or if you studied culture in general, you can say, okay, this question's been asked 1,000 times, but none of these answers work. And this is another answer to that question, or this is another approach to that question. Or it might be the case that there's a question within your culture, and you're going to write a story about it. And it might be the case that you say, okay, this question's been asked. A lot of people have answered it. A lot of people have written stories about it, but there's this one piece, there's this one niche that nobody's actually addressed. There's this one aspect of reality that nobody's addressed in relation to it, and that's what I'm writing my story about. That's how it can affect you, okay? So besides that, what are other ways to integrate your cultural heritage? Besides just knowing about it and just understanding it to a greater degree I think it's something that is going to come into your art through osmosis, whatever you want to call it. in some way like that. But you can take cultural pieces and you can put them into what you're creating, right? You can study up on your culture because, well, that's a little different. You can think about the ideas presented to you through your culture, and then you can respond to them, right? And that, I think, it's going to be more relevant depending on what you're responding to. It's going to be more relevant to the people around you because they're within that culture too. They're doing thinking too. You're not the only one thinking, and other people are thinking and other people are reading. And if you present something about a specific thing that's already come into your culture before you, people are probably going to respond and either going to say, that seems to be right, or they're going to disagree with it, or they're going to say, there is some value to what you're doing because it's addressing the specific thing. Besides that, you're actually becoming a part of that great conversation, whether it's in the West or whether it's somewhere else. Nowadays, the great conversation it's brought in so many different cultures. It's not just the West that's part of that great conversation. It's something that is always so prominent, and maybe because Nintendo is really prominent and video games are so prominent in the United States. But Japanese culture is part of that conversation now. There's things coming into the West, whether it's through manga or it's through television like Pokemon or through Nintendo. And yes, these things are adding to the conversation, and you can decide how much they're adding to the conversation, but they are adding to the conversation. But whatever it is, whatever's being brought into the West and people are engaging with that culture, that's becoming part of the conversation of the West, right? And in a way, Japan has become part of the West. Not just because I don't think that Japan has just become part of the West because they wear business suits or they trade with countries that are traditionally part of the West. I think Japan has become more part of the West because they take things from other cultures and they bring them into their own, right? I think one of the reasons why Japan can do this in a way that other cultures probably can't. I believe that Japan, from what I understand, and I might be wrong about this, I believe that Japan has done this historically where they take pieces of other cultures and they bring them into their own and they integrate it into their culture and they make it their culture. So I think Japan continues to do that with the things they come into contact with the United States or Europe. They bring that into their culture, they make it part of their culture, and they become part of the conversation that the West has been having for hundreds of years in a way that other cultures haven't in the same way, or other countries haven't who aren't part of the West. So I think that does happen. I think that the West is a term that it's expandable. It's expandable to different countries if they want to be part of it. So one thing I would say to anyone who thinks this is valuable, to anyone who says, I think that's important to actually understand where I'm coming from, understand ideas that have come before me, understand art, understand literature that's come before me. One thing I would say is that you have to do this yourself. I think that you have to actually make a plan to study up on your culture, to understand your culture, and so that you can engage in it better. And I certainly don't think that I understand the Western culture fully, and I think that it's actually good to read up on other cultures as well, because I think that since the world has become, since it's so interconnected with the world, we're not just connecting to people who are inside our little bubble. So I think it's good to start with the culture that is traditionally yours, and then expand beyond that to understand others. So you don't stereotype those other cultures. You don't stereotype your own. You don't stereotype those other cultures. You don't strawman your own, or you make it as you say it's the best thing ever. And you don't strawman or say those other cultures are the best thing ever, because every culture has good and bad. Every country has good and bad. Every person has good and bad within them, and every person is going to be creating things that have good and bad ideas and present things in the world in a way that is truthful and untruthful, even me. So, I mean, if I'm doing that, I mean, other people must, right? But no, I think you have to study up on it your own, and I think it's something you just have to make it part of your life. And I think you're going to like life better. I actually think it gives more meaning to life, but I also think, like I said, I think it makes your art better. And I would, if there's anybody who's out there who hasn't studied up on their culture or hasn't understood the broader cultural context they're within, if there's somebody out there who says, I don't think this is true, I would say just test it, see if it works. Study up on it, and if you get to the end of it and you say, this actually made my art worse, or it didn't do anything, it didn't affect it in any way, you can shoot me a message on some platform of some sort, and you can say I'm completely wrong. Go ahead, that's fine.